We're saying goodbye to the rigid numbers and strict budgets and putting relationships back at the heart of personal finance. This is more than a podcast, it's an invitation to reimagine your money story and journey with us through a landscape of intuitive strategies and abundance. Join a community that nurtures transformative financial mindsets. Welcome to Intuitive Finance. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the show. My guest today is Mr. Robert Wunderlich. Robert has followed several meaningful pursuits in life. He has a master's degree in anthropology from the University of Wyoming. He holds a third degree black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and is a men's coach. He works to bring a unique alchemy of his education, his teaching, and life's experience into his and other people's lives. Robert began consistently training in 2004 and received his black belt under Dave Ruiz in December of 2012. He competed in local international tournaments, traveled the country as a referee for Fight to Win Pro, and he currently operates the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu Association, Shokunin, and the Academy of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in Arvada, Colorado. Robert began his journey into men's work in 2020 at the beginning of the pandemic. He became a certified UNcivilized Men's coach in September of 2021, and he is building a method to combat isolation and loneliness by fostering a deep connection with oneself and others. Ladies and gentlemen, one of the best things for me as a podcast host is the people I get to meet on this journey. But Robert is one of those people who is unique in the fact that he's also a big part of my life. He is my black belt that I train under, and we did the same coaching certification programs together, and we both started our men's work journey at around the same time. He is somebody who has a big heart, is an amazing person to watch on the mat, is a master of his craft and everything he does. I cannot wait to get into this conversation. So without further ado, my interview with Robert Wunderlich. Mr. Robert Wunderlich, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, sir. It's great to be on.
I got to tell you that I'm super excited for this conversation because I think your perspective, particularly on the coaching and the relationship space, is so unique with being what you've done in BJJ and how you then take that practice of which you are a master and then translate it into your coaching practice, into life, into lessons, into helping develop young men and young women. And so I want to start there with how does your practice in BJJ relate to life?
Honestly, like one of my good friends, Ruben, and I, we've had many conversations about this, but in my perspective, there aren't many analogs to life quite like jiu-jitsu. The patterns that you see in life of ebbs and flows are the same patterns that you see in jiu-jitsu. There's sometimes when you're training, your game's on point and it feels great, and you feel like you're taking in a lot of things and learning a lot of things, and then other times you come in and you're more of the nail than you are the hammer, and you spend a little more time understanding that that's a part of all of this. And really just getting to that space where you can reduce it from like life. Something that I personally learned is reducing it from what looks like an EKG in life, like the ups and downs, to just having more of a normal flow and those waves a little bit further apart, if that makes sense.
So if I'm hearing you, and as somebody who practices BJJ myself, and I've been through plenty of ebbs and flows in my short period of time doing this, it sounds like what you're kind of relating to is the season. That there's seasons in which you're going to be ascendant and seasons in which you're going to be learning. Do I have that right?
Well, I would say that those seasons come a little more quickly in a space like jiu-jitsu than it does necessarily like a season of life, if that makes sense. At least through my experience, through my personal experience, that like it can be a day-to-day thing. Like you can come in and feel really good about your game one day, and the next day you come in and your game just feels like it's trash. And what I personally see from observing a lot of my students is sometimes that has to do with what's happening below the surface for people, what's happening inside of their lives or outside of the gym that is impacting them can really impact the way that they view jiu-jitsu also. Like too much of their outside life will follow them into the door that day and kind of get in the way of being able to just do jiu-jitsu, if that makes sense.
So when you're talking about those ebbs and flows, and in jiu-jitsu and in life, what what have you found helps people through those? And I'm asking as much for myself as for anyone else here, because I run into those seasons where, just like you said, a lot of my personal life finds a way to follow me around into the podcasting space, into the coaching space, into other spaces where I don't want it to be. How does somebody go through that and continue on the path?
That's a good question, Dylan. And I think that it's one of those things that's very simply said, but not easily done. For me, it's comes down to two primary words, and that's perseverance and repetition.
Tell me more about that.
Like I said, it's simply said, not simply done.
Of course,
So
if we just went to life into the sound bites, we would hand you like Marcus Aurelius meditations and be like, here you go, good luck.
So perseverance is the persistence in doing something despite difficulty or delay in achieving success.
Oh, wow! I just get like goosebumps all over my body of like, oh, that delay of success, right? You're hammering, you're hammering. I see this in part of the reason I bring such an eclectic group of guests on is I talk about money, but I find that like the lessons that really make a solid financial life are typically found someplace not my spreadsheets. As much as that pains me as an accountant, and that delayed gratification of like I'm not getting this right, I'm failing, I'm having this issue. That's so common for people when they're looking at this and going like, oh, I should be good at this thing, or I don't know why this is so hard for me, and yet
Okay,
they
so
have to keep being to persevere.
I said some things that I hear very, very often in my academy. I will have
Hmm.
students that within the first 3 classes, I'll be teaching them a technique and I can watch their body and the frustration build in their body because they're not necessarily getting it correct, that they're failing
Hmm.
right there in that moment. And watching that and seeing, and this is another way that analogs life, right? And a lot of times I go up and just ask them this very simple question, like, what do you do for work? And they're like, well, I'm in a jiu-jitsu class. Why are you one? I can see it in them. Like, why is he asking me what I do for work? Like, what does this have to do with jiu-jitsu? And they'll tell me, and I'll just do it. For example, here, Dylan, what do you do for work? I know a lot of people follow you. But just describe like your latest job that you currently have. You do.
W-2 wise, I'm an internal auditor for a large corporation.
Okay, so you're
I
an
sit at a
internal
desk and
auditor.
I tell stories with numbers.
And you and we've known each other for a while now, and I kind of know the shifts that you've been making in life. And you went from a other large corporation to a new large corporation. And I know you're a very intelligent person, but that first day, what was that first day on that new job like? Did you know exactly what was expected of you? Did you know where, like on their system, where to find the documents that you needed, where to run your audits, how to do those? Like, did you have that all framework on that first day?
No, it was like drinking from a fire hose. And
Okay,
it was
bro.
such a blow to my ego because it's like for all of my education and intelligence and expertise, I suddenly feel like a rank amateur again.
People do when they first come into jiu-jitsu. I was one of them too. The first time I came into jiu-jitsu, I was absolute amateur beyond amateur, right? Like I had 2 left hands and 2 left feet. So, but we build this expectation of ourselves that we need to be able to get it now. But that's not what perseverance is, right? Perseverance, getting back to perseverance, is doesn't difficulty or delay in achieving success. It's the difficulty and the delay or the delay. I mean, let's be real. There's going to be delay if there's difficulty. If we're going to continue to fail at something, there's going to be a delayed like sense of achievement.
Hmm.
That is the juice. Everything that's worth doing is a process, in my opinion. So you ask how this might inform other aspects of my life. That's what it does. Is jiu-jitsu allows me to understand that so many things in life are a process, which allows more grace and compassion for myself instead of expectation that, man, I've got to come in and I've got to be at this level here. I actually can give myself some grace and compassion and understand that like this is where I'm at right now, and that's okay. Doesn't mean that I'm not going to grow, but it's going to be a more delayed process than maybe I want. But my students that come in and they expect after repping something 9 times that they're supposed to be fluid at it and they're supposed to do it without any mistakes and everything along those lines, but that's just not reality.
Right.
But
Well,
that's what
I
that's the load that we put on ourselves though, right? Just like you felt in that moment of, man, I've been in this industry for a long time and now I'm at a different job, but I don't know where anything is. So you feel
yeah.
like a little kerfuffle and just out of place and don't understand what's happening. So then what does that do, right? Then we feel overwhelmed, or we feel anxious, or we feel out of place, or we feel frustrated. Like all those things come in. But if we just take just a small moment to take a breath and say, okay, I know where I'm at, and that's okay. Tomorrow is going to be a better day. A week from now, where am I going to be at? 2 weeks from now, where am I going to be at? Like I got to understand that this is going to be a process.
Right. Well, and I loved the statement you just had, is anything worth doing is going to be a process, right? Like we all, I think at the end of the day, want to have that success that we can all be proud of, and people look like, wow, like I would love to be on your level, and be like, man, I spent a long time in libraries late at night studying to do what I'm doing, or in your case, going every day or every other day, going into jiu-jitsu and tournaments and seminars and all that other stuff to get to where you're at. And so for someone looking at the success, they're like, oh, I can't wait to be there. And so now I'm impatient. And I find that lack of patience to be a killer in a lot of levels.
Absolutely. Or the expectation of like looking at someone else and saying, oh, well, why aren't I at their level? I should be there. I should, like, a student will look at me. I've been doing jiu-jitsu almost 20 years. Well, 20 years, right? And they'll have a thought that like that's what it's supposed to be. So that's what I'm supposed to do. But that's not my expectation of them. That's their own inherent expectation of them in that moment, of themselves. And it's just like, oh, well, here's someone that I can learn from. And now I'm going to just take the time to learn from them. And I'm going to, instead of having more of a closed mindset, I'm going to have more of an open mindset. But
Do
shifts.
you find that? Do you find that the and just having gone into the academy with working with jiu-jitsu, I've always found it very useful to be able to look at the different belts, be like, oh, that's a brown belt, that's a purple belt, this is someone ahead of me in the path, and I can go to them to learn XYZ. A piece of advice I give in the coaching practice a lot is, if you want something, find somebody who has what you want, and then go ask them two questions: what do you do, and how do you do it? And I feel like in jiu-jitsu, there's just a plethora of opportunities to do that, because you can easily identify, just based upon the belts, who might have been here longer than you.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that goes in like, not everybody needs to be a coach, right? Like, not everybody wants to be a coach, but and I'm saying this in jiu-jitsu, I'm saying that in life coaching, men's coaching, like it could be anything, really. Like not everybody wants to be a manager at work, but that doesn't mean, so I have a person who's a white belt that maybe has been training for 6 months, and then the person who just got his 20 classes and is doing his first intermediate advanced class. That person that's been training for 6 months can still provide a small little nugget to make that other person better. We don't have to necessarily be a black belt in order to help another. Does that mean that that white belt's teaching a whole class and teaching that person? Like, there is a point where we're over teaching, or we're going beyond our own understanding. And I think that's a whole nother conversation, is sometimes we go beyond where we actually are. Does that make sense? Like yeah, I'll just leave it at that. I think that we think that we're at one place and we teach at that place, but really we need to be a little more thoughtful in where we are actually, if that makes sense.
I liked what you said with the idea that, like, oh, even the white belt who's just getting into being able to roll live classes has something of value to teach, because they might be better at one thing, or they might really understand one thing that you don't. And I think I think it's an excellent piece of advice when you're looking around trying to figure out how to improve your life, to understand that, like, everybody's got some pearl of wisdom to impart.
And that goes beyond that. That actually goes full circle. That I tell my students all the time that they can provide me with new information and I can learn things from them, whether they're a person who just got their first stripe on a white belt, whether they've been training for 6 years, whether they've been training for 25. Because to me, that is the sign of someone, like, the best teachers are the ones who've never stopped being an actual student.
I think that that's true in the therapy world as well. I once asked a friend of ours, mutual acquaintance Michael Gay. I said, "What makes I asked him. I said, you feel like you're more competent and capable in this therapy space." And at the time, I was very skeptical of therapy. I said, "So what makes you different? What makes Dewey, another man I've had on the podcast, a good friend and mentor of both of us, what makes you different?" And they both answered the same way: "I'm not done learning." Here you have Dewey, somebody who's got over 80,000 contact hours, taught at a university, 73 years old, and he's constantly looking for the next thing to learn, the next level of his technique. And I think that's huge, because I think people think that success is a destination. Once I get to this place, I'll check the box and then I'm good. For the rest of my life, I've got this thing. But it sounds like,
But
especially from BJJ, that's not true.
that's another way of saying that that's utopia, right?
Yeah.
You just found utopia. Like, you check the box, okay, I'm done. I can just relax. Like, I don't want a life like that personally.
What kind of life do you want?
One that I'm constantly learning, one that I fall and fail and pick myself up and have good times and have crappy times and have the ebbs and flows and the seasons, whatever you want to call it. Like, that's a life that's not perfect. I'm a recovering perfectionist. We'll put it that way. So just understanding that, I don't know, I just have a different view of what perfection is. To me, perfection is like, it's not being perfect anymore. It's the constant seeking of perfection that actually makes it perfect. And that's the big piece, is that I'm constantly seeking it, is that I will never, ever get there. And that's okay. I will never achieve perfection. And that's totally okay. And it's totally acceptable.
I relate to the idea that, like, if I'm looking for perfection, the perfection is found in the practice. Is that, like, you will never find perfection, but you will always find practice. I'm butchering this phrase, and I know that.
Yeah, it goes back to that what we started this conversation with, is that anything worth doing contains a process. It is process, period. I'm constantly in process. I'm constantly seeking. I'm constantly looking for what's next. And sometimes that means also that I don't have to do a lot. That's another thing that we gotta, like, be cautious of, is a lot of times we have this thought that, like, oh, well, I must always be doing at this high level. There's also time to allow things to process in ourselves as well, to take some time to breathe and, hey, to take a step back and allow things to move instead of just always doing, because always doing is another way that we can bypass some things too. Or another, to put it back into like a jiu-jitsu perspective, like, I don't believe there's any one way that anyone should train all the time. So say, Dylan, that you're getting ready for a competition, right? Which I think I have discussed that by February you would like to compete, right? So
right.
In January, we're going to start training for it. And you're going to have a different mentality and a different way of training for that next 6 weeks. But I wouldn't expect that that's the way you train at my academy year round 100% of the time.
Right. Right. In part, the training is training because we're evolving into the practice. We're moving into seasons.
Well, you're training at that level to get ready for a competition, but if we trained only at that level, so if you trained at a level 8 year round, how would you know what you're missing in your game?
Well, you'd be very focused and you probably burn out.
Yeah, you'd burn out, you get injured. So you train at a level 8 year round, you go and compete at a level 10, right? And then you come back and you only train at a level 8 for the rest of the year. Like, what lessons can you take from what you need to work on in competition? Instead, coming back from that competition, and maybe now I trained at a level 8 for 6 weeks. For the next 4 weeks, I'm going to train at a level 2, and I'm going to have some focus on exactly what I know I need to work on. Like, man, I really struggled from escaping this position in a tournament. So I'm going to come back to the drawing board. I'm going to slow things down so I can better understand what I need to do in those moments. And then from there, vary that training up and down, up and down, up and down, and then change my focus on how I train. There's so many ways to look at this, if that makes sense.
100%. 100%. And that I think that iteration on this process, I think, is really important to really like hammer home, because there's going to be places where you're going to have to ramp up, and then you actually have to go back and do the after action report to understand what went well, what didn't. You know, I don't coach people through escaping the mount, but I do coach people through like, hey, you made some mistakes with your money. You failed in the conversation here. It went off the rails. You know, let's stop, and now that we're beyond that, now we're beyond the time where we're trying to pay off some debt or we're trying to save for this thing. Let's go back and think about how we could have done that better, or what part of our practice was missing that we can add to, that we can grow on.
Right. And how do you open that up? Because if we just go back to that same mentality of go, 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 then things are collapsed, right? They're about an inch wide. But how do we slow it down that over the next month, this is the only thing I'm going to focus on? So we open it up more so we can understand the mechanics of that one thing in that space instead of all the things.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's one of those things that I think is really hard for people, because when we start off going through school, right? When we're learning to be adults, there's this expectation. You take the test and then you got one shot at it. And if you either make the mark, you don't make the mark. And if you miss the mark, well, now you're in trouble and you got to go through remedial education. And I think that this engenders this idea that a process is actually bad, that we're missing something. And if we
But
go through a process, we're somehow underperforming.
the process requires thought, reflection. It's a process in itself, right? To not define a
Right.
word with the same word, but it is that's what it is it takes more patience. And I guess another way that I would say this too is something my professor used to say to me as I came up in jiu-jitsu, was that one small shift in the kaleidoscope changes all views.
Ooh, tell me more about that.
Well, I know that you've read Carol Dweck, or not Carol Dweck. Carol Dweck is another good book, but what's her name?
Martha Beck.
Yes, thank you, Martha Beck. I was close. Sometimes the wires get crossed. But Martha Beck, and she talks about if you flew to Australia and you changed the course of that flight by 1 degree, where would you end up?
Ooh, not Australia for sure.
Right? So if we flew from Denver to Australia and you changed the course of that flight by 0.5 degree, where would you end up?
Also not Australia.
So I think that says it all in itself, right? So the small shift totally changes the course that you're on over that process. So it's actually the small things. So finding those small victories, finding those small habits, those things that take the daily practice, those are the things that are going to change your life over the long run, more so than the massive change that we all feel that we need. From that instant gratification, we think this big thing is going to be the thing that satiates us. That's going to be the thing that oh man, now I've made it. Like you said earlier, I've checked the box. But really, what does that mean? Because there's only one time that I think that we arrive to where we're no longer going to be in process, when we die.
That's heavy. That's heavy. What's astounding to me is I had a sex and relationship expert coach on the podcast, Jordan Gray, and he had talked a lot about if you stop and think about you look at what the compounding rate of return and whatever it is you're doing is going to be in 5, 10, 15 years. If you keep doing this exact thing, where do you end up? And then I had a health and fitness expert, Josh Wood, on the podcast. He talked about tiny noticeable things, TNT. You keep doing that, you stack them, and eventually you can move mountains with TNT. And now I have an expert in the field of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu who's talking about altering the course of an aircraft. It is astounding to me how much parallel between relationship, family, friends, fitness, all of these things, when we get to talking about how do we make substantial change, it's always going to be the little things. It's never going to be the big things, is it?
It's one small shift in your mindset. It's one tiny decision. I mean, how did you get here where you are today? How did I get here where I am today? It happened. It didn't happen overnight for me. It wasn't like, oh, you know what? I really need some help in my life. I'm going to seek a men's coach.
Right.
I woke up one day and bam, all of a sudden now I need to start looking up men's coaches on Instagram. I need to find one right now in this moment. And then now my whole life's going to change. No, it
Right.
happened over the course of years, man. I had another mentor that's here at my academy. His name's Griff. He's wonderful. We spent a lot of time on the mat, and he would just ask me simple questions like, hey man, how's your marriage? Like, how's your relationship with your kids? Hey, how's your anger? Like, oh, tell me more about your anger. Like, oh, you're angry. Okay, well, let's talk about that. And it wasn't life coaching. It wasn't anything like that. We just would have conversations. And eventually and then the pandemic hit. And then, well, now I've got more time on my hands. So my mind's running through more things, which means like, oh man. And then I reached out to a buddy and he's like, man, why don't you try some meditation? And then I tried some meditation. And then after meditation, it was like, oh, then I started to see these other people. And one of our mutual friends, Traver Bohm, was one of those guys that was like, oh, he kept on popping up on my feed because the algorithm was like, hey, I need to feed this guy some of this stuff. And then all of a sudden he's like talking about the balance of the primal and the divine. And all of a sudden I was like, ooh, I like the sound of that because that's kind of where I feel like we need to be. I don't really agree with like so much primal. I definitely don't necessarily agree with just all divine. Like we need to have some semblance of understanding both. And then, oh, and he does jiu-jitsu. Okay. Yeah. I kind of like this guy. So, that's from there. That's when I reached out and was like, hey man, like I'd love to talk to you about possibly working with you. And then the rest is kind of history. So
right.
It wasn't things that were these massive shifts. Everything that's happened in my life since then is like, you look back and it's crazy how far we've gone. That's the whole thing too, is I think, man, sorry, something just hit me. Because we spend so little time on the landscape, actually moving on the landscape, like walking on the landscape, I think we forget what it's like to look back and see how far we've gone with something that takes time. Like hunting, going out and hunting, and you walk out and you walk the trail and you're like huffing and puffing and you kind of forget about where you are. And then all of a sudden you look back and man, I've gone 3 miles in already. Man, I've got another 3, but like you just put your head down and you walk up the trail. And that doesn't mean that you don't stop and like take a look around and notice the scenery and notice the small things, notice how the terrain's shifting, all the other things along the way. But it's important to also take that step back and kind of like, man, I really have come far, and give myself that credit, right?
Oh yeah. Well, and I loved what you said about it. It took years and years to put me in this position where I could say yes to this thing. And I feel like with a lot of people, they jump off a cliff and they're like, burn the bridges, go big or go home. And then they burn out. And I think about in my own growth in dealing with old family stories and old systems that didn't serve me, and realizing that what I'm capable of now, I wish what I'm doing now I had done 10 years ago. But the man I was 10 years ago wouldn't have had no context to even understand what I was saying. And so I have to just be very, very present in this moment to be grateful where I'm at right now and go, I just need to take the next step.
And that's what we should be seeking to do. And I don't should on myself often, but that's what we need to seek is, where am I now? And what's going to be my next moment? Not what's going to happen 10 years from now. Like, yeah, we can plan for that, but that shouldn't be my sole focus, right?
100%. 100%.
Like,
well,
and 10 years ago, because I'm only going to get depressed because it's like one is a choice for anxiety. The other is a choice for depression.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
I mean, 10 years ago, I was still teaching, man.
Me too. Just jiu-jitsu.
Yeah.
Maybe a little anthropology.
Yeah. Well, and you brought up coaching and you brought up anthropology. So I would like to just kind of shift into there, because you've got your academy, but you're also a men's coach, and you're also somebody who's engaged in archaeology and anthropology professionally, which of course is the study of humans. And so I feel like you've got this triad of really human experiences to discuss. So I would love to know, like, how has jiu-jitsu really informed your path as a coach, and how did it inform your path as an anthropologist?
I don't think I could say one, like have one without the other. So I'll define it like this, or I'll put it like this. I'll use a definition of culture that Clifford Geertz, a well-known American anthropologist, said, that I feel is like one of the best ways to like contemplate what culture is. And he says that culture is the threads of significance that we ourselves spin.
Unpack that for me.
So the things that we do culturally are things that we ourselves, that's what it is. It's what we do, what we choose to do, what we choose to do as a group. So think about the myriad of different ways that people have existed on this planet, and ways that we don't even know, like aren't even aware of anymore, because they no longer exist. It could have been a small group that died out, and that language died out, and now we no longer have access to that knowledge anymore, right? So just think of all the different ways. Here, I'll put it in. So Wade Davis is another anthropologist. He's a social anthropologist from Canada, and he talks about how like the rate that we're losing languages now is like 1 every 2 weeks, basically, on the planet. Which, if you think about it, you're the last speaker of that language. You're the last holder of that knowledge. And that's just another way that we as human beings have, come up with solving solution of what it means to be human.
That I find is super poignant. When I did my education master's, I studied language and how it interfaced with mathematical achievement. And one of the big thinkers that I drew a lot from was a guy by the name of Lev Vygotsky. He was a contemporary of Piaget for development. The problem, of course, was that he was a Soviet, so Cold War politics being what it is. But he had always talked about how language was literally the thought in your brain. Like that, if you said the same sentence, but you changed one word, your brain would light up differently. And at the time he was speculating, but now with fMRI machines, we can actually see that. And so when I think about like your language is the way in which you express and process information through your cognitive structure, that means that if you use different words, you're going to get different results. But if you change the language, you're changing the software, aren't you? And so if we're losing one language, what you say, every 2 weeks, then we are losing like our ability to perceive and process information in the world as humans is closing then. That's terrifying.
Absolutely. So you know about Zach Bush. So I'm going to kind of go and cover several different ways here. But first, I just want to just stay here with me for a sec. So what happened this weekend weather-wise here in Denver?
Snowed.
It snowed. Okay. So how many different ways can you say the words? Can you describe snow? How many other words do we have in the English language for snow?
I mean, other than sleet and hail, which would be the closest approximations, we got one, maybe two.
So in First Nations up in Canada, in Inuit, they had over 100 different words for snow.
Right. Yeah. So I imagine they have a different word for like the soft, fluffy stuff.
Yep. For the way that the wind was blowing, so they knew how to navigate. Like the knowledge that went with those particular words helped them survive in that climate.
Wow.
And then brought meaning to their lives as well. Does that make sense? Does that help kind of bring that definition back to some semblance of light? Like the webs of significance that we ourselves spin. So that's just language. That's not cultural material. That's not spirituality. That's not like all of those other things are all parts of that also.
Right.
And they're interwoven, and they're not separable either.
Right. Well, and there's got to be a level of appreciation for what one sees or how one defines something. Right. And I always think about like, and this is a really kind of cheap example, but like, is it the Atlantic Ocean or the Oceania Atlantica? Right. Like that, which one comes first, the defining factor or the thing itself? And even just on how we talk about things, when I lived overseas and I was learning Chinese, to learn that there's no conjugations in Mandarin. They don't say like run, running, ran. They don't say that. They will say I run, tomorrow I run, now I run, later I run. There's no conjugation of the verb. The verb just is a thing. And that makes such a difference when we say like, oh, the rain was really heavy today. Like it's this oppressive thing that's weighing us down. But in Chinese, you say big rain. It's a big rain instead of a small rain. And so for them, like that changes how they deal with rain, because it's not heavy. It's just big.
Yeah, man. So getting back to that kind of diversity thing, like just losing a language every 2 weeks, which I think that's an estimation, but Regardless, are you familiar with Zach Bush?
I am not.
So he is a very intelligent person. I think he's got like, dude, anyways, he's on the Rich Roll podcast a few times, but he talks about immune function, and he's on. So he started as an MD, I think, in cancer research. I might just hack this, but it's okay. And then he saw that like it was like he wasn't really helping. So then he started looking at gut health and then the biome that we're destroying in the soil. So he opened a farm, and like, dude, he's a very, very, very intelligent person. But one of the things that I took from him is that like he talks about gut health and he talks about cancer in the gut. So he's saying that it's like the more diversity that is within the gut as far as cells go, the healthier the gut. The lack of diversity is when you start to see cancer. That's what allows cancer to form, right? So if we extrapolate that the health of a system is dictated on its diversity, then think about how we're losing a language every 2 weeks and how humans are going more and more to monoculture than they are in diversification of culture.
Yeah. Yeah. Like, so this relates, I swear, but when I first started gardening, I realized why I hated vegetables. And it was because when I pulled, and I remember it was a green bean. I pulled a green bean off my stalk and I ate it. And it was like a whole new world. Like Aladdin showed up. There was a magic carpet. There was a genie. It was great. And I bit into it and I was like, I can't believe just the musical symphony I've just tasted. And it was the same with my tomatoes. It was the same with my carrots, everything. But I put a lot of effort into making the soil very rich with worms and bacteria and composts and different bugs and stuff like that. And then here in Colorado, it's a little bit harder than it was in Wisconsin, but having to plant companions, basil plants with my tomatoes and marigolds with my tomatoes, and growing that up. And the food that we produce on our land is just so much more fulfilling. And I think about like when I eat a store-bought tomato now, it's like, yeah, this doesn't taste like a tomato. It's like the LaCroix version of a tomato. It was shown a tomato and told tastes like this.
Yes, I think, well, that's, again, think about what I just said about monoculture, think about monoagriculture. How many thousands of acres of like homogeneous land is utilized for just tomatoes, just corn, just cotton?
Yeah.
Like just massive, massive plots of land. I mean, I think it's like 1.4 million contiguous acres in around Amarillo, Texas, that like is just for cotton. And that's the only crop that's produced there.
Yeah.
Like, we have this idea that that's the way that we should produce crops, but in reality, like if you look at agriculturalists from prehistory and into the proto-historic and historic eras, like when we just had Thanksgiving, right? I mean, that's a holiday. What's Thanksgiving known for?
Turkey.
And what else? Like what happened? What's the story of Thanksgiving? What did we learn?
Oh, the story of Thanksgiving with the Native Americans helped out the settlers by bringing them food to survive the winter, and then they had a big feast to celebrate it. It was the first Thanksgiving.
Yeah. Well, they also taught them how to plant those crops because they knew what would be best suited for the land. And what they would do is plant a stalk of corn, and then they'd plant beans and squash around them as companions, so that the stalk of corn created a hanger for the viney plants to actually hang on. And they all lived in like more of a symbiosis.
Yeah, the three sisters.
Three sisters, that's right.
Yeah. Well, and I think about that a lot, and I live in the suburbs, and anyone who's the audience has been around, but been with me for a while, they know that I'm not a fan of the suburbs. And part of what I'm not a fan of is there's no personality out here, right? Like I'm kind of forced. There's no other system for me to exist in. There's no walkable communities. We have one way of transport, that's with cars. We don't have a diversity of things, and that my mind is the dehumanizing experience, because in my mind, like, why do I want people to get their financial house in order? Because it's time for us to remember we're humans again. If we can take that animal and get it off our back, and we can actually deal with it in a healthy way, we can start doing things that are more human. And I love what you said about the diversity of options, because like in a cornfield, there's nothing else out there. The bugs that normally would be there, they're not there. The animals that they're not there. Like, we've lost so much of that. And if you go and you spend time, like I live by a reservoir, you go walk out in the fields, like there are bunnies and there are hawks and there are chickadees all over the place. Like it's alive. But you can go to a farm and it's like the silence is eerie because there's just nothing out there.
Yeah, man. I think, and just think about that alone. Just think how that shift in mindset could go so far in today's world. Diversification is a positive thing. So therefore, other is not a bad thing. It's actually a good thing.
100%. And I feel like that diversity has become a very loaded term here in the modern age. But there's also an argument to be said for like the monoculture, though, that we're experiencing, where everything's the same. I can have the exact same cheeseburger in Milwaukee as I can have here. And then what are we doing? We're all longing for local fare, and half the local fare is buying from Cisco, or US Foods, and it's all the same stuff.
Well, I mean, my grandma came over in 1929 from Italy, and she never spoke Italian in our family. Never. Because how she was berated and teased and bullied when she first came over and started school here in America is she didn't want to speak Italian because that's not what Americans do, right? I mean, just think about that alone. But it is that diversification in my mind that creates these awesome communities that we live in. I mean, man, if you think about going to New York, what food do you think about? If you go eat in New York, what do you think about? Huh?
New York pizza.
Okay, pizza. What
New
else?
York pizza.
But what else? What else would you think about eating?
I'm not the best person for this. I've been to New York one time.
Okay, so like we'll use another example. So like London. When I think about London, I mean, this isn't any offense to English people. I'm mostly English, so English Irish. So like but like English food is not that flavorful in my personal opinion, right?
I'd agree.
But when you go to London, what else do you have there other than English food?
There's plenty of Pakistani food there.
Like Indian, like African. Okay, so you get this diversification, and you can go in and have all kinds of different foods. You can experience all kinds of different culture. You can hear the native language spoke. You can actually experience those flavors and what it means to put those things together. Like think about what it is to eat Indian curry versus Japanese curry. Think of what it's like. Think what it's like to have. And then you get all these amalgamations too, to where like think about. Do you like pho? Like Vietnamese
I love
soup?
pho.
Okay, so what is pho? Where did it come from?
Vietnam.
It did, but it's also French influence, right? So,
right.
So you have this amalgamation of these things, and then that creates new things. So like, I'm just really simply trying to say that like diversification is a positive thing, and to not necessarily. I mean, tribalism is dangerous, right? Like me versus you, I think is a dangerous way of thinking about it. One of the most profound things that I ever learned in anthropology, and this is something that I learned about in biological anthropology, is the study of our ancestry, basically, like where did we come from as the species and how did we evolve into the species that we are today. And there's more genetic variation within a population than there are between populations.
That seems really counterintuitive.
So think about, and that's true for many things. There's more variation in the height of men with men than there are between men and women.
Okay.
So there's more variation in the height of women than there are between men and women. So genetically, there's more genetic variation within a population, say, of Africa than there is between Africa and Europe.
That makes sense. So it's essentially you're when you're looking between those populations, the variations that you see are just the population variations, but the baseline human's the same.
Yep.
Whereas within the population, when you're looking at the variations, there's more of those different markers.
Yep. Than there are
That's
between the two. Isn't that awesome?
It's a wild way to look at it.
So like, okay, well, doesn't that eliminate some of the difference between us and other? Because there's actually more variation within us than there are between us and other.
So then what then creates the cultural, I mean, in the current age and when this releases, who knows what's going to be happening with the Ukrainian conflict or the Israel-Palestinian conflict, what what is then drive if that is the case, there's so much more, you know, similarities than there are differences. What's driving that conflict then?
The thought process of other. I mean, we just
Thought
continue
process.
to say it's like, well, it's, well, I think like this and you think like that. You're different than me. So therefore, instead of
Hmm.
embracing like, oh, okay. And I think, I think we've lost the ability in many ways to hold paradox.
Give me an example of a paradox that we've lost the ability to hold.
Well, I think just paradox in general, just understanding what paradox is understanding that two things can be true at the same time.
Okay.
At the same time.
Yeah, and that is one thing that I've worked a lot with Dewey on, in to say that two things can be true at the same time. You know, yes, we could be having XYZ problem, and your response to the problem is inappropriate. Like yes, there's something you're responding to, and that's not okay. And the way you responded is also not okay. You know, or yeah, you found one way in which this works, and this person found another way in which this works, and both of them are fine. And I feel like there's a tension. So with all of the knowledge that you have about the anthropology, about the variations, about the ideas of others, and with all the knowledge you have, you know, how does that all come together into how you coach and how you teach jujitsu?
I would say it, that is my, that's the alchemy. That's what makes me unique, is the ability to draw on those facets, right? So like throw in nature in there too. Like I've spent a massive amount of time outdoors doing archaeology and just understanding that connection to the outdoors. So like those three major facets: nature, the study and understanding of who we are, where we come from, you know, as human beings through anthropology, and then how we interact with one another on a mat in general, with conflict and friction, and how friction really produces things that are wonderful. I think that's what makes me an interesting coach, is that I can take those three things and then kind of funnel them into and guide someone through some things that they may be experiencing in life.
That's amazing. Well, and I feel like being able to look at that in a much bigger context, be able to look at the humans in a much bigger context is super important. You know, even in the financial world, when people come in, they want to dehumanize everything and be like, no, hold on. This is a system that was born out of humans and human activity and human choices. So how do we rehumanize these? So these numbers are just not numbers; they're real things. You know,
Yeah, man.
and
And
what is that?
I think it's important, and I didn't mean to step on your toes there, Dylan, but like I think it's important that we understand that there is no one way. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that that answers that previous question, that there isn't just one way, and that we need to, just like there's ebbs and flows in life, I think we also need to have a process of, sometimes we need to be ultra focused and we're just looking at the cell of a tree. And then sometimes we need to zoom out a little bit and see that it actually is a tree. And sometimes we need to zoom out a little bit more and see that there's a forest of trees. And then sometimes we need to zoom out even more and see that it's a forest on a landscape.
Right, right. It reminds me of the first time I read the book Omnivore's Dilemma. And there's a scene where he was talking to Joe Salatin. It was Polyface Farms, and they talk about the land, and he has this grove of trees, this forest up on the property. It takes about a fourth of his property, and they say, well, why don't you mow that down and you can get more land to farm? And he said, no, those trees are holding water on the property. I need those, otherwise the rest of it doesn't work. And it never had occurred to me that plants hold water in the soil. Now, I was like 22 years old. It had never occurred to me that plants hold water in the soil.
Yeah, man. I mean, just think of it like this: like, how many people nowadays know? I mean, I guess I could ask you this question. I think I assume that you know what a 7.5 minute USGS quadrangle is. How many people do? How many people know how to read that map? How many people know what township and range is and what UTM is, or like lat long, or anything along those lines? Like, how many people have shot an azimuth on a point, on 2 points, to be able to triangulate their position on a map? Like, I think we've lost some of the map. We've lost some of the ability to look at a map and say, okay, well, here's a mile. Well, there's this point, here's this point, and here I am. Like, just that kind of wider view, if that makes sense.
Right. Well, and I take your example to not be our literal ability at orient, but it's just how to navigate life that we've lost a lot of knowledge. Fun fact: the
Yeah,
only reason I even know that is because I was trained as a geotech by my brother, who needed me to go help him move rocks.
but that's something that, and it is a literal sense, but it's not in the sense of you like reading that map. It's that how many of us can actually locate where we are in life?
Right.
How can we shoot an azimuth over here and shoot an azimuth over here and say, oh, well, here I am, and that's why I think it's so important that we don't just take one view in life, that really it's always like, hey, I need to be detailed right now. I need to grind, but I also need to let it breathe a little bit and see what's coming ahead. Let me take a little bit higher view so I can see what the landscape looks like. Let me come back in and see what's going on in the minute details. Let me take a little more mid-range view. Does that make sense? Because I think that, I mean, how many times have you seen in money that story is one of the biggest impediments to somebody's ability to be successful?
100% of the time.
Okay. So in coaching, how many times have you seen someone who's just like, man, it's going to be Mount Everest for me to climb out of this hole that I'm currently in. The shit that I'm in right now is, man, it's going to be way worse to have to like actually go forward than it is to just stay comfortable in my shit.
All the time. There's so many people
So
who
how does
don't want to
anyone,
move because they're afraid of having to go through that.
right? And how big of a step does it take to actually just start moving?
The tiniest of things.
It's just one step. It's the first, and then it's the next, and then it's the next. And then sooner than later you turn around and you're like, man, I've come a little distance. And then, this isn't quite Mount Everest, is it?
Yeah. Well, I used to say all the time when I was in grad school and trying to get off welfare and grow my life, people was like, where are you going? And I was like, I have no idea, but I do know that this is the step right in front of me. So I'm going to really take this step, like on a scale of 1 to 10, I'm going to take this step at a 12. And I
Mm-hmm.
would just do that. When I got there, I'd be like, okay, what's the next thing? Then the next thing. And then years later, I was reading a fantasy book by Brandon Sanderson, and he asked a question in it. It's a huge book, but he asked one of the brother. This man asks his brother, "What's the most important step a man can take?" And they spend the whole book, 1,200 pages, explaining that it's the next one. The most important step a man can take is the next one. And when I read that, I was like, "Oh my God, that's exactly it." It's not about the peak. Like yes, no, you have a vague direction of we're going in that direction, but just whatever steps in front of you, just take that step. Don't worry about the peak. Just take that step. Whatever's right in front, then take the next one. Always take the next one. And I
100%.
feel like that's forgotten wisdom.
Oh, bro, I would definitely agree. So have you heard of Boyd Vardy? Have you read any Boyd Vardy?
I have his book downloaded on your suggestion. I have not got there yet.
Okay, so the Lion Tracker's Guide to Life.
Yep.
One of his mentors in that book said, when talking about tracking, so he was a lion tracker, and Wunderlich is this preserve in South Africa where they take tours out and they send these people out to track these lions so the tour groups get a chance to see them. And he said this, that I don't know exactly where I'm going, but I know exactly how to get there. So when you're tracking a
That is
lion, you don't know exactly where you're going. So really what it comes down to, and this is Boyd Vardy speaking, is like what it really comes down to is just find the next track.
yeah. Yeah,
All it
that
comes down to is just the next track, because you don't know where you're going. And that's why I think setting those smaller goals is so important in life. Is it's what's it like, just take the next step. You can put things out into the distance, but have that be a broader target. I think sometimes we create these goals that are just so hyper focused that it must be this one thing, but like, well, I want to be in this range by this point because I don't know exactly how I'm going to get there, but I know exactly where I'm going.
right, right. Well, and if you for your money, which one would you rather have? To not know exactly where you're going, but know how to get there, or to know exactly where you're going but have no clue how to get there?
Man, how much frustration is built from the latter in people's lives,
Right?
that, oh, this is exactly where I want to go, but I have no idea how to get there.
What's wild to me is when people come into coaching with me, a lot of times I always ask them like, where are we going? Like ideally, where do we end up? and we work on creating a vision and getting that vision to be emotional. And I always try to find like one thing that I know we can work on. And then we start working on that thing. And after we worked on it for a while and we've had some successes, we sit down and go, okay, let's rewrite the vision. They're like, well, why? I have it. I was like, well, because now you have a different perspective. Like the man who wrote that vision's gone. Now you're a new person. So let's find the next thing. And if it's the same thing, great. Like we can keep going in that direction. But let's double check, because the worst thing in the world would be to get to the top of the peak and go, I didn't want to be here in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. So it sounds similar to what I do in my practices. I work to help people connect back into themselves first. Like who are you? Who resides in this body? What resides in this body? Like how much do we spend time in our head, and how little connection do we have to our body? And coming back to that space of like, man, let's get home first. Let's find home first, because we've been wandering the desert for a while, thinking that we know where we're going, but not having any idea how to get there. But I think the way there is through us first, right? We've got to connect to ourselves first.
100%. Well, Robert, this has been an amazing conversation. I want to be really respectful of your time. But if people who are listening want to find more Robert Wunderlich in their life, where can they find you?
I've got a website, nexuscoachingservices.com. They can find more information about my coaching practice there. I'm on Instagram at WonderBJJ99 with a WU, not a W. Nexus Coaching on Instagram. They can find me through my academy, the Academy of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu Arvada. I'm open and willing to talk to anybody. If something resonated in you, man, I'm more than happy to have a conversation. And that doesn't mean that this is a sales pitch. Me as a human being, me as a person, Dylan, when I truly say that I'm just willing to sit down and talk to anybody, I mean that. So
%. And at 10 out of 10, if something did land for you, reach out. Well, we'll get that all linked up in the show notes. Again, thank you so much for coming on.
Man, Dylan, this has been a great conversation, man. I really appreciate you. I appreciate you as a human. I appreciate having your friendship in my life. So thanks again for having me on, and I look forward to doing this again sometime.
Fantastic. Thanks for listening. The conversation doesn't end here. Please share this show with friends and make sure you keep up with all the latest updates on Instagram and Threads at @TheDylanBain, and dive deeper into the world of finance with me at dylanbain.com, where you'll find insights, resources, and strategies to reimagine your money story.